السلام عليكم. كي داير الماتش؟ بخير، داز بخير وعلى خير. دابا كنتفرج في اسبانيا وبغيت نقول لكم واحد الفيديو مهم جدا سجلته البارح، واحد الانترفيو ديال سام بانكمان فرايد، هذاك السيد ديال اف تي اكس. اول استجواب اللي دار لايف ديريكت مع هذيك التلفزيون اللي انا كنتفرج فيه ديما، اللي هو سي ان بي سي، اللي ديال البيزنس نيوز. دار واحد الاستجواب فيه بزاف ديال الصراحه، فيه بزاف ديال الحوايج جداد ما اكتشفتوهمش، ان شاء الله تكتشفوهم. انا ما نقدرش نترجم انا الفيديو كامل، ولكن غنحاول نلوح لكم الفيديو كامل. سير شوفوا. وانا غنلوح مره غنلوح واحد اللقطات ديال الترجمه مره باش تعرف اشنو طاري في الاف تي اكس. وكاينين اخبار زوينه اللي غتعرفها على كريبتو كورنسي، وشي اخبار اللي مزيانه اللي ولا بد غادي تتعلم ليها في هذا الفيديو. الفيديو مهم جدا وغادي يدخل في التاريخ ديال ديال الكريبتو كورنسي عامه، لانه هذا الفيديو هذا غيوريك شي حوايج اللي كيخصهم شحال هادي يطراو في الكريبتو كورنسي ودابا غيداروا. دونك هذا الحدث اللي وقع ديال سام بانكمان فرايز حدث مهم جدا وماشي يعني با نيجليجي، زعما ما خصناش نهملوه، لانه مهم جدا. هو اللي غيقلب الكريبتو كورنسي بواحد الطريقه، غيولي الكريبتو كورنسي والمعامله في الكريبتو كورنسي بواحد الطريقه مزيانه وهي في الصالح ديالنا ان شاء الله. تبعوا معي الفيديو من الاول حتى الاخر، غادي نوري لكم وغتسمعوه بالانجليزيه اش كيقول، غتسمحوا لي، ولكن مره غادي نلوح اللقطات ونشرح تقريبا اشنو قال، وفي الاخر غنقول لكم ان الراي ديالي الخاص. وانت غتقول الراي ديالك الخاص ملي غتشوف الفيديو. كل واحد يبقى حر في الراي ديالو. اوكي، تابعوا معي الفيديو من الاول حتى الاخر.
To the Deal Book Conference now, you see Andrew Ross Sorkin walking on the stage for his conversation with Sam Bankman-Fried, and we're going to listen in, everybody.
And thank you for staying for the entire day so that we can do what I think may be one of the most important interviews we will do today. In the span of about 1 week, Sam Bankman-Fried went from a billionaire, the white knight of the crypto world, and running one of the largest exchanges, to what some people think has become a wanted man. FTX was once valued at $32 billion. It's now effectively worthless in bankruptcy. We're going to talk about that and whether investors will ever get money back. There are multiple billions owed to creditors and big questions. In the wake of the collapse, Bitcoin fell to its lowest price in 2 years, and on Monday, BlockFi, which had been bailed out by FTX, filed for bankruptcy. The rapid fall of this empire has left so many questions about crypto, about the future of it, and whether it can be trusted again. Sam Bankman-Fried joins us right now, live from the Bahamas. Sam, I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. I appreciate your willingness to have this conversation. As I said at the outset of today, there are a lot of questions that need to be asked and also need to be answered. As you know, a lot of people have been hurt, genuinely hurt. And my hope is that over the time we have together, that we can have a candid conversation about what happened, how it happened. There are people who are angry, and they are seeking answers. I just want everybody in the audience to know that I received thousands of letters and emails, even the past couple of days, from a lot of these people who feel like they're victims. And some of them have questioned whether we should have this conversation, whether we should have this interview. There are people who don't believe that this conversation should happen. And I just want to say that I think our job as journalists is to have those conversations, is to ask those questions and seek those answers on behalf of the public. And that is especially true right now. Sam, here's where I want to start this conversation, if we could. I think at this point there are two ways to view what has happened at FTX. And I know we'll get into all of the details in a moment. But I'm just going to go very basic. There is a generous view, and the generous view is that you are a young man who made a series of terrible, very bad decisions. The less generous view is that you have committed a massive fraud, that this is a Ponzi scheme, a manipulation of the system. And I want to start there because I think that there are so many people who have that question, which is, what is this? And what did happen?
Yeah, look, thanks for having me. And at the end of the day, I was CEO of FTX. And that means whatever happened, whenever it happened, I had a duty to all of our stakeholders, to our customers, our creditors. I had a duty to our employees, to our investors, and to the regulators of the world to do right by them, to make sure the right things happen to the company. And clearly, I didn't do a good job of that. Clearly, I made a lot of mistakes or things I would give anything to be able to do over again. I didn't ever try to commit fraud on anyone. I was excited about the prospects of FTX a month ago. I saw it as a thriving, growing business. I was shocked by what happened this month, and reconstructing it. Were there things I wish I had done differently?
Well, let's talk about some of the things you would want to have done differently. But I don't want this to be an abstraction for folks, because it's a lot of big numbers and often doesn't feel human. One of the letters I got, I want to read to you, Sam, because it's from a gentleman who said that he lost his life savings. And the subject line is, Sam Bankman-Fried stole $2 million from me. It says, Andrew, can you please ask SBF why he decided to steal my life savings and the $10 billion more from customers to give to his hedge fund, Alameda? Can you ask him why his hedge fund was leveraging long all of these S coins? I'm going to keep it polite for the kids. Please ask him if he thinks what happened was fraud. These are the kinds of letters that I've been getting repeatedly over the past several days. What do you tell this man?
Yeah. I'm deeply sorry about what happened. Here's, the long and short of what happened. And I'll start by saying, just to make a distinction here, you look at the US platform, you look at the international platform. The US platform, it's a US regulated platform with American users. To my knowledge, that's fully solvent, that's fully funded. And, I believe that withdrawals could be opened up today and everyone could be made whole from that none of these problems plagued the US platform. Then you look at the international platform, for their non-US users. And, as the letter says, Alameda Research did have a long position. And the international platform, it's a margin trading platform, it's a derivatives platform. It's a platform where all the clients were, going on, placing something as collateral and using that to put on a position, whether that's a futures position, a spot position, a borrow. And what the exchange was storing was the collateral from all of those positions. Alameda Research was, one of those that put on positions there. And as I try and reconstruct this, over the last month, I have limited access to data, but my view of it, from what I have been able to see, is roughly that, basically, look, a year ago, Alameda had, I think, something like 10% leverage, had something like 10 times the assets of the position that it had on. Over the course of the last year, there were a number of market crashes that drove the value of those assets down and the leverage up. I think it was, to my knowledge, still under 2x leverage, as of a month ago. You look at what happened this month, and in a few days, all out, PR assault, which led to a total market collapse in a pretty short period of time, no bid-side liquidity. More than $10 billion wiped off in a matter of days. And realistically speaking, no ability for FTX to be able to liquidate that position and generate everything that was owed from
But
it.
I think the bigger question is where Alameda got the loan from,
Yeah.
which is to say that there is a view that this is about commingling of funds.
Right.
And in that letter that I just read you, this gentleman actually copy and pasted the terms of service for FTX into the email. And I just want to read you this. It says, none of the digital assets in your account are the property of or shall or may be loaned to FTX Trading. FTX Trading does not represent or treat digital assets in users' accounts as belonging to FTX Trading. So how is it possible that Alameda had this loan of such a large size?
So there's that piece from the terms of service, but there were a number of other parts of the terms of service and a number of other parts of the platform on top of that. There's the borrow lending facility, where users were lending billions of dollars of assets to each other, collateralized by assets on the exchange. You had obviously futures contracts where there are leveraged positions on. Now, of course, all of this, it's meant to be the case that these are positions where FTX could, if it needed to, margin call those positions and close them down in time such that it would cover all of those, all those shorts, all those liabilities. Obviously, that wasn't the case here, and that's a massive failure of oversight of risk management and of diffusion of responsibility from myself running FTX.
But just make this very straight. Was there commingling of funds? That's what it appears like. It appears like there's been a genuine commingling of the funds that are of FTX customers that were not supposed to be commingled with your separate firm.
I didn't knowingly commingle funds. And again, one piece of this, you have the margin trading. You have, customers borrowing from each other. Alameda is one of those. I was frankly surprised by how big Alameda's position was, which points to another failure of oversight on my part, and failure to appoint someone to be chiefly in charge of that. But I wasn't trying to commingle funds.
Let me ask you this. The Wall Street Journal reported that Carolyn Ellison told Alameda staffers that Alameda used FTX client funds to cover loans that were being recalled because of the Luna-triggered credit crunch. Carolyn says that she, Sam, Gary were aware of this. How do you square that with what you originally said over Twitter, that this was an $8 billion accounting mistake?
So I'll point to two things. And first of all, obviously, I don't know what anyone else is thinking here. I can only talk about it from what I know, from what I knew. And a lot of this is reconstructing it over the last month. I have limited access to data, but what it seems like happened is in the middle of the year, a lot of, most of the borrow lending desks in the space blew out or closed down. And it seems like Alameda had, margin positions opened with them, and that it likely moved a bunch of that over to FTX this year when they shut down. And that means, I think it was over collateralized positions, but positions that involve substantial size and substantial US dollar size on the borrow side. In terms of the accounting mistake, again, looking through what happened, I think that there is a substantial discrepancy between what the financials were, what the audited financials were, the true financials, what the exchange understood. All of that was consistent, versus what the dashboards that we had displayed for Alameda's account there, which substantially under displayed the size of that position. And so that's one of the reasons that I was surprised when we dug into everything at how big that position had become.
But would you would agree that there is a much more closely connected version of FTX International and Alameda than previously understood? Fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, given the size of the position, I think it was, if not in intention, it was in effect tied together substantially more than I would have ever wanted it to be.
So you did an interview earlier this summer with Bloomberg, and you were asked about the connection between Alameda and FTX, and you said that obviously came from the same place because it started that way, and the same original people, but most of the remaining nexuses, you said, have dropped off.
Yep.
I know the people from Alameda decently well, almost as if you don't know what's happening there. And there isn't like a large amount, of ways remain that we are actively working together. Anything like that. Alameda is a wholly separate entity. They're different offices, like different principal offices. We don't have any shared personnel. We're also not the same company. We not all are under the same corporate umbrella or anything like that. And yet it seems like Alameda people were living in the same penthouse where you may very well be right now altogether.
Most of Alameda was not there. I don't live there now, but or not there now. I have not lived there for much of the time. But I did live with one or two members of Alameda for a little while. And I'll also say that as I was earlier this summer looking at the relationship, and this is a pretty big mistake and oversight of mine. I was viewing it primarily from the trading volume perspective because that's what drives our revenue. And so when I was looking at how intertwined are FTX and Alameda, I was looking at, well, what fraction of trading volume, what fraction of liquidity on the platform does Alameda represent? That had fallen off from something like 45% in 2019 to something like 2% this year. But in terms of positions and balances, it was a much larger fraction. I hadn't been looking at that. That's a pretty big oversight.
But Sam, I think the question is whether you were supposed to have access to these accounts to begin with. If I worked at a bank and was a bank teller, and I decided to leave the bank at the end of the evening and take the cash that I ostensibly had access to, even if I intended to bring it back to the bank later, even with more money to give them back, I still stole the money.
Look, I wasn't running Alameda. I didn't know exactly what was going on. I didn't know the size of their position. A lot of these are things I've learned over the last month that I learned as I was sort of frantically digging into this on November 6th, November 7th, November 8th. Obviously that's a pretty big mistake on Mark. That's a pretty big oversight that I wasn't more aware. I think I was scared of I was nervous because of the conflict of interest about being too involved. Obviously that shouldn't have meant that I didn't have real oversight, and it really shouldn't have meant that I failed to appoint anyone to be in charge of that oversight, that relationship. But I haven't been running Alameda. I haven't been, thinking about its finances. I haven't been, making those decisions. But as CEO of FTX, it was still my duty to make sure that someone was doing diligence. I was a large owner of it. That is true, and I had a lot of exposure on that side. But
so why wouldn't you have been focused on it if, in fact, that's actually where the profits were?
Well, I don't know that that's where. I think Alameda had made trading profits over the last few years, but FTX had made profits as well. FTX had been a profitable, growing business, and that was more than a full-time job. I didn't have the bandwidth to run two companies at once. I didn't have the attention for it. And again, I was nervous about a conflict of interest between those two, and so was pretty intentional about not being very involved in what was happening at Alameda.
When did the commingling of assets begin?
So, and again, lots of traders had open margin positions on FTX where they would have borrows of assets, where they would be short some asset against, against other assets as collateral. That being said, again, looking through this now, I think that position size for Alameda got substantially larger over the course of 2022, and that it was, I think, substantially larger by October of 2022, probably by July of 2022 than it had been in April.
But it sounds like it's fair to say that there was always a connection between Alameda and FTX, and almost, not almost, but from the very, very beginning, and then it never really stopped.
Well, I think it had been, in some ways, reducing. When you scroll back to 2019, Alameda and FTX were very connected in a number of ways. One of these was that Alameda was the primary liquidity provider on FTX. It was, 40-something% of volume. It was the backstop liquidity provider. You scroll forward to 2022, it was down to 2% of volume. We had a lot of backstop liquidity providers, but it still had a big margin position on. And I was failing to pay nearly enough attention to positions and positional risk on the exchange, and to Alameda's in particular. And I also, frankly, made a mistake that I feel pretty embarrassed to have made. I mean, a lot of these are, but I substantially underestimated what the scale of a market crash could look like and what the speed of it could look like and how correlated it would be.
But that just suggests that you were just hoping, perhaps hoping against hope, that this would all work out and that nobody therefore would realize what this commingling was all about?
So it's not how I viewed it. And in particular, again, most of the firms had margin positions. Most of the firms had burrows on FTX. The problem here, this was too big. I was surprised by the size of
But it's not just
what it
too
was.
big. It's assets that, look, it sounds like there were assets that may have been allowable to be loaned, but then there were assets that weren't allowable to be loaned, no?
So I'm still looking into the details of some pieces of this, but I do think that in addition to what I had seen as sort of law of the standard borrows here, that when we scroll back to 2018, or to 2019, I guess, FTX didn't have bank accounts. It didn't have any bank accounts globally. We were trying to get them. It took us a while, took us a few years. And there are customers who wanted to wire money to FTX. And so I think in the meantime, some of them were wiring money to Alameda Research to get credited on FTX. And I think that was a substantial sum. And I think that the FTX's internal accounting did correctly, effectively try to debit Alameda for those funds, but it didn't happen in the primary account. And so it didn't happen, it created a discrepancy between the display of the account and what was really going on there. And I'm still looking into exactly how that worked mechanically. But that did make that position size substantially larger than I thought, and I think then what you would have gotten from most of the normal avenues.
What do you make of the argument that Alameda was used to effectively wash money into FTX, that American investors, who, by the way, were not technically allowed to even invest on FTX, were doing so, and FTX was doing it knowingly because the know your customer rules were being flouted by using this separate vehicle?
How would that allow customers to flout the know your customer rules? Are you talking about people who are trading on FTX US, or are you talking about customers of FTX International?
International. You just said that there was money being sent to Alameda, and that Alameda was then providing credits onto FTX.
Right. But those users still had to go through the know your customer policy on FTX in order to do that. In order to use that ramp, customers still had to go through FTX's normal KYC onboarding.
So when do you think you knew there was a problem?
So, the time that I really knew there was a problem was November 6th. November 6th was, that was the date that the, tweet about FTT came out. And by late on November 6th, we were putting together all of the data, putting together all the information that obviously I should have put together way earlier. That obviously should have been part of the dashboards I was always looking at. And when we looked at that, there was a potential serious problem there. And Alameda's position was big on FTX. It had just taken a huge hit. It had taken hits over the course of the year, but that was a particularly, large and very abrupt. And we're seeing a run on the bank start, and that was leading to, $4 billion a day of client withdrawals. At that point, we started calling prospective, sources of financing because I was nervous about what was going to happen there. If you rewind even a few days, I was a little bit nervous, but not on nearly the same scale. And I was thinking about risks that were substantially less.
When you say you were nervous, the company was going to go under. You were nervous you were going to get caught. What were you nervous about?
On November 6th or before then?
Either.
So I think before then, what I was nervous about was that basically, and this started, I would say, November 2nd or so, when there was, the Alameda balance sheet, through CoinDesk, and when I started to think a bit more about this, I was nervous that that would lead to substantial losses for Alameda, and that it would be a bit messy. I didn't think it was existential for FTX. I didn't think it was going to lead to a massive loss for FTX's customers. I was thinking of this as more like Alameda is going to be really tight on funds, and that maybe it would end up having some small impact on FTX, but not a significant one, not one that hurt customers at all. When you're talking about November 6th, late November 6th, then, and especially as we bleed into November 7th and 8th, I start to become nervous that FTX is not going to be able to fill customer withdrawals. And, by late November 6th, I am very nervous about that. And I'm starting to think about emergency scenarios. And I'm starting to think about things might end quite badly here. And the core metric that I'm thinking of there is, will we be able to make sure all customers are whole? And, on November 5th, I was feeling quite good about that. On November 7th, I was feeling quite uneasy about that.
I want to go back in time for a moment. This summer, you were described oftentimes as the J.P. Morgan of crypto, referencing the 1907 panic that he helped prevent. And you had purchased BlockFi, were making investments in Voyager and all sorts of other things. When you were doing that at that time, how much of that was an effort to prop up the value of things like FTT, which was the token of FTX, knowing that if a company like BlockFi, which owned a ton of it, that if it collapsed, FTT would collapse, and in large part, the quote-unquote collateral that you had for Alameda would collapse?
So I don't think any of the borrow lending desks, to my knowledge, owned a lot of FTT. I think a lot of them, may have been using it as collateral, or taking it as collateral. I don't think they owned it though, or were going to sell it. And I think that most of them ended up closing down effectively all of their lines with Alameda one way or another. And so at that point, I think that was close to a sunk cost. And so I wasn't viewing it as having any impact on FTT in particular. I did view it as important for the industry's health. I did view it as a thing where I wanted to try to keep the industry stable. But I don't think it had any, really large FTT specific impact.
And did it have it? You didn't think it had any impact? It would have had no impact on Alameda or FTX if, for example, BlockFi were to have failed?
I don't think it would have had large direct impact. And the reason I say that is that I believe that Alameda ended up returning the vast majority of its open, borrowers of its margin positions with the borrow lending desks in the middle of this year anyway. And so at that point, there wasn't that much left to save from that. At that point, I think the bigger thing was just not wanting the industry to implode.
Let's talk about collateral, because I think this entire experience has been a revelation for a lot of people about what might be collateral. And clearly you were using FTT and Solana and other tokens as collateral, and part of that required you to mark them in a specific way, a value to them.
Yep.
Do you think that you were marking them properly?
In Alamia's case, I don't think I was marking them the way I wish I had from a risk perspective. And I want to sort of differentiate here, like expected value or sort of like worth or something like that from security. And, I think that I don't have any strong statements to make about, what value they're assigned from sort of like, a upside perspective or even a median case perspective. But clearly I was not nearly cautious enough from a downside perspective, from an extreme downside perspective. And, I can tell you in my head, I was looking at a 30% down move over a few day period as a sort of like extreme tail case event that, we had seen once before. And then, what happened here was a 95% down move over the course of a year, and a 60% down move over a few day period with very little liquidity, and all happening at once in all of these coins in a correlated fashion, in which hedges didn't mean as much also because this was a specific crash on assets associated with Alameda research rather than all assets. And so, even correlated hedges had limited use there, and a run on the bank at the same time. And all of that are things, in retrospect, I should have expected might happen in an extreme scenario because that's how markets work. And, we've seen other examples of that in history where when things get really bad, they get really bad for all of the relevant things at once in a very direct and correlated and quick way.
I want to go back to the BlockFi acquisition for a moment. How much money do you think Alameda, I'd say the bail out of FTT, but that Alameda had borrowed from BlockFi at the time of the bailout?
I honestly don't know, but I would have guessed like 100 million, maybe a couple 100 million, but I honestly don't know the answer to that. I wasn't like running on, I wasn't paying detailed attention. That's my guess.
And were you using FTT and Serum and other things to collateralize the loans at BlockFi, do you think? I mean, this goes to the whole idea of both the value of these things and also whether you were trying to buy BlockFi, in fact, to continue to support effectively Alameda or FTX.
Right. It might be. I would guess it was, but to your point, my guess is that like the amount paid for BlockFi was probably bigger than the amount that Alameda had open with it. I don't know that for sure. But I wasn't even looking at what that number was really. But I think that's about right.
I want to go back to the Alameda piece of it for just another moment, if you'd stick with me here. You told investors and regulators that you were not involved in Alameda decision making, and yet in the case, Alameda invested $1.15 billion in Genesis digital assets without your consultation or approval. That's the question. And my understanding is you also served on the board of Genesis digital assets. And so I'm trying to understand how you wouldn't have been involved with Alameda.
So I was somewhat involved with venture investing, and that was done out of a separate entity than any of Alameda's proprietary trading, than its activity on FTX or other crypto exchanges. But I was consulted on some of its VC investments, including with GDA.
What are your lawyers telling you right now? Are they suggesting this is a good idea for you to be speaking?
No, they're very much not. The classic advice, right? Don't say anything. Recede into a hole. And it's not who I am. It's not who I want to be. I think I have a duty to talk to people. I have a duty to explain what happened, and I think I have a duty to do everything I can to try and do what's right. If there's anything I can do to try and help customers out here, and I don't see what good is accomplished by me just sitting locked, in a room pretending the outside world doesn't exist.
You're in the Bahamas right now. Are you in the Bahamas because you think you can't leave?
No, I'm in the Bahamas. I have been in the Bahamas for the last year, and I've been running FTX from the Bahamas. I've been running FTX Digital Market, our primary operating entity down here. With Bahamian regulators and others in contact, and right now I'm looking to be helpful anywhere I can with any of the global entities that that would want my help.
Do you think you could come to the United States or go elsewhere?
To my knowledge, I could.
Have you thought about doing that?
I've thought about it, and I've seen a lot of the obviously a lot of the hearings that have been happening. I would not be surprised if sometime I am up there talking about what happened to our representatives, or wherever else is most appropriate.
How concerned are you about criminal liability at this point?
So I don't think that. Obviously, I don't personally think that I have. But I think the real answer is that's not. It sounds weird to say, but I think the real answer is that's not what I'm focusing on. It's there's going to be a time and a place for me to sort of think about myself and my own future, but I don't think this is it. Like, right now, look, I've had a bad month. This is not really a time for me, but that's not what matters here. Like, what matters here is the millions of customers. What matters here is all the stakeholders in FTX who got hurt, and trying to do everything I can to help them out. And as long as that's the case, like, I don't think that what happens with me is the important part of that, and I don't think that's what it makes sense for me to be focusing on.
Sam, help me with this. On November 7th, you tweeted and then deleted a tweet that said, quote, "FTX has enough to cover all client holdings. We don't invest client assets, even treasuries. We've been processing all withdrawals and will continue to be," unquote. You then deleted that tweet. And literally just moments ago, you told me it was on November 7th that things took a turn.
Yep.
You telling the truth?
So things were changing fast. And, when you look at November 6th, I was feeling nervous, but I felt like things were probably going to end up okay. We still had, assets way larger than liabilities, and yeah, there's increasing withdrawal demand, but we were meeting all of it. We were processing all of it, although it was a weekend, so we were a day delayed on a lot of wire transfers and stablecoin creations, and Bitcoin node was overloaded, but their assets were continuing to process. By November 8th, I did not think the odds were that high that we were going to be able to meet all client demand, and I was worried that there was going to be a substantial liquidity shortfall. November 7th, that was sort of the transition day, and even just the start versus the end of November 7th, I felt fairly different. And I can't remember exactly what I was thinking or when I said that, but I remember trying to think about feeling conflicted about what to say, and trying to think about what I could say that I believed. And by not that long later, I no longer believed that. That no longer felt like it had much, like that was a at all reasonable representation of where my mind was at. And I don't remember exactly when I deleted it, but I remember at some point I was like, it shouldn't be there.
Let me ask you a different question, because this is all around the same time. The New York Times reported that $515 million was suspiciously, in quote, transferred from FTX wallets after the bankruptcy filing.
Yes.
And there have been accusations that this is the assistance, effectively, of theft. Where did that money go?
So I will caveat this by saying, at that point, I was being cut off from systems. And so I'll give you the answer to the extent that I know it, which is that I believe that a few different things happened within a short period there. I think that the U.S. team took actions to seize some of the assets and put it in custody from the exchange. I believe that it has been announced that the Bahamian regulators took some of the assets into safekeeping as well around that same time. And I think there may have, in addition to both of those, also been some actually improper access of assets on the exchange. And I don't know the details of that. I don't have the resources to trace through exactly what happened there. And I don't know who is behind that third part.
I want to go back to one thing about the Bahamas. The Bahamian authorities have now admitted effectively that they ordered the transfer, it sounds like, of certain FTX assets to wallets under their control after the U.S. bankruptcy was filed. Did you help them with that? Did you discuss that with them?
So I can't discuss specifics, but I will note that prior to Chapter 11 having been filed, the Bahamian authorities had placed FTX Digital Markets, the Bahamian entity, which is the primary operating entity of FTX International, under supervision of a JPL system in the Bahamas with oversight from the Securities Commission of the Bahamas. And, were, to my knowledge, taking actions to protect FDM's, clients and customers there.
Can we just go back for just 1 second? I apologize for belaboring this point, but we were talking about FTX and the derivative piece of it earlier, and I had made a note earlier about this because you had told the Senate, so you were sitting in the Senate at the time, on February 9th, 2022, during a hearing, you said, quote, on FTX US derivatives, all of these contracts are fully collateralized. Was that true?
Yes, and again, FTX US, to my knowledge, totally solvent. FTX US derivatives, totally solvent. And in fact, I believe FTX US derivatives, LedgerX, may even be up and running right now. I'm confused why FTX US is not processing customer withdrawals right now. I would think it should be, because I believe, to my knowledge, that it could be and could make all Americans 100% whole from this. So and FTX US derivatives, as I said there, doesn't even allow leverage of any sort. It was close to a spot trading platform. And so, to my knowledge, all American customers and all American regulated businesses and exchanges here are, I think, at least in terms of client assets, are okay. Obviously, I don't know what's happened with, you can make your own judgments about the enterprise value of those businesses, but.
Over the summer, you paid a $2.5 billion loan to Barry Silbert's Genesis. This was in August. And I was just trying to think through the dynamics of what might have been happening at your firm and was wondering, where did the money come from?
So when you say you did that, I presume that that's Alameda Research that
Yes.
did that? Is that right?
Yes, yeah. That's the case.
So I don't have all of the details there, but my understanding is that, and I don't know exactly what's going on Genesis's side then, and I don't know now, but my understanding is I believe Genesis tried to call in a large number of loans from Alameda. I believe that happened, and that closed down a lot of positions that Alameda had open with Genesis and other trading desks. And that was what I was thinking at the time. And that's, I think, what happened there. I also think that may have led to an increase of position size of Alameda on FTX in retrospect.
You did an interview, I think perhaps inadvertently, over Twitter DMs with a reporter at Vox, and had spoken about ESG, but also about what you described as the shibboleths of what it meant to look good in corporate America today. And that a lot of the things that you were doing were not necessarily things you actually believed or believed in. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a frustrating experience. It was not meant to be a public interview. It was a longtime friend of mine who I stupidly forgot was also a reporter. I thought I was speaking in a personal capacity. I'm not sure what they thought the capacity was at the time, but it certainly ended up being reported on. And I think what I'd say is, look, there are a lot of things that I think have real massive impact on the world, and ultimately that's what I care about the most. And I mean, I think frankly that the blockchain industry could have substantial positive impact, but I was thinking a lot about bed nets and malaria, about saving people from diseases no one should die from, about animal welfare, about pandemic prevention, and what could be done on a large scale to help mitigate those things. I think matter, and they're among the most important things to me. Separately from that, there's a bunch of bullshit that regulated companies do to try and look good, and these are things that
اول حاجه كيف سمعتوا، اول حاجه قال هي بانه كيبشر بالناس ديال الميريكان بانه راه كلشي في امان الله، ولكن ما عمركم ما تديو على الكلام اللي تيقول. وديما تيقول راه كلشي بخير كلشي بخير. سمحوا لي قفرت هنا، ولكن ما عرفناش دابا واش هادشي اللي كيقول بصح ولا لا. انا شخصيا كيبان لي بانه ماشي هو هذاك، ومن بعد ان شاء الله خصني ندير واحد الفيديو خاص بهذاك اللي خاد اللي ولا هو اللي مقابل هذا FTX، لانه ملي كدير بانكرابسي، ملي كدير فايت، كتعطي الدوسي للدوله، الدوله هي اللي كتكلف بالشؤون ديال الشركه ديال كامله. كيحطوا واحد كوميسير كونط ولا شي حاجه، كيحطوه كيولي هو اللي مقابل الشغل ديال كامل، مقابل لك العكاس الفلوس وكل شيء، هو اللي كيقابل لك كل شيء. كاين واحد السيد اللي مقابل ليه دابا الشغالات، قال لك بانه داكشي كاتاستروفيك، قال لك بانه داكشي كاتاستروفيك يا لطيف منه، في بزاف ديال المسائل اللي ماشي هما هذوك. من بعد غندير واحد الفيديو خاص باش نهضر على هذا الشيء. اوكي. هو قال لك اودي، اول حاجه قال لك بانه الناس ديال الميريكان الدنيا هانيه، فلوس ديالهم وداكشي في امان الله، ما كاينش مشكل. وانا سمحوا لي هذا الشيء اللي درت، ولا راه ما كناش كنتلاعبوا فلوس. حتى الصحفي سولو قال لي واش كنتو كتلاعبوا فلوس ديال الناس، فلوس ديال الناس كتشدوهم كتبداو تصيفطوهم بعضياتهم. هو خاد واحد 6000 ديال المليار ولا 2 المليار ديال الدولار باش تاخذ 6000 غير هكاك. اسبانيا ماركات بيت. كوريا دار التعادل. الله يحفظ منطيهم اسبانيا ان شاء الله. نطيحوا مع كوريا، نطيحوا وقيلا مع جابان، ماشي كوريا سوري، جابان دار التعادل. اما نطيحوا مع جابان، اما نطيحوا مع كوستاريكا ياك ولا اسبانيا. ان شاء الله نطيحوا مع كوستاريكا ولا يلا اجاب الله. alright سو هادشي اللي كاين. دونك هو هادشي اللي بدا كيقول في الفيديو، ونزيدو تسمعوا كامل داكشي اللي كيقول، ومن بعد غنقول لكم تقريبا الشرح اللي قال. عاوتاني قال لهم بانه هذاك الصحفي تيسولو تيقول له واش انت كتحس براسك هذاك الشيء اللي درتي جريمه ولا لا؟ قلت راه جريمه، فهمت؟ الا شديتي انت لاعبتي في الفلوس ديال الناس كتسمى جريمه. غنوري عاوتاني واحد الحاجه نوضحها عاوتاني الناس باش يفهموا. الا كان عندك كريبتو كورنسي، الا حطيتي مثلا شي كريبتو وبداو الناس كيشريوها، راه ماشي فلوس صافي تشدهم تلعب بهم كما بغيتي، راه مازال فلوس ديال الناس، لانه انا شريت واحد العمله عندك، ماشي عطيتك فلوس انت باش تمشي تكسر بهم ولا تشري بهم الدار، ولا شري الوالدي فيلا مع 2 مليون تما في البهاماس ولا شي حاجه مثلا. اوكي، وخاصك تبقى مسؤول عليها. اوكي. قال لي واش انت كتحس براسك زعما راك مجرم وهذا الشيء اللي درتي راه جريمه ولا لا؟ قال لي انا ما كنفكرش في هذا الشيء نهائيا، انا كنفكر غير كيفاش نساعد الناس باش يرجعوا فلوسهم. واللي نسيت ما شرحتش في الاول، كاين واحد السيد اللي قال ليه بانه انا حطيت عندك 2 مليون ديال الدولار، وهذا اللايف سيفين زعما هو الفلوس ديال الحياه ديالي كامله، اللي وهذا غيكون راجل شي شويه كبير في السن كنظن، حط لا روتريت ديالو كامله فلوس لا روتريت. دونك الا مشاو هذوك 2 مليون، هذاك السيد غادي ينتحر، لانه ما يمكنليش مازال يمشي يخدم ويجمع وداك الشيء. زعما فلوس ديال الحياه ديالو كامله حطهم معاه وتصيد. وهذه غلطه عاوتاني بالنسبه لنا حنا كاملين. ما عمرك ما تحط فلوس كاملين عند واحد ولا في حاجه، كتسمى انت طماع. اوكي، ما يمكنش تحط فلوس كاملين. اوكي، هذه غير عاوتاني واحد اللقطه لهذوك الناس اللي تيقولوا لي حطيت فيها فلوسي كاملين. نو، ما عمرك. اي عمله نقول لك غطلع، ولا يقول لك شي واحد اخر، ولا ما عرفتش عبد القادر الجيلاني جا عندك يقول لك في التليفون يعيط عليك ولا تحلم به بالليل، يقول لك اودي راه واحد العمله اكس راه غادي تطلع مع في السماوات، عمرك ما تحط فلوس كاملين. حط فيها وصافي. ضرب حساب بانه هذاك السيد كما كان النوع ديالو يقدر يغلط ويقدر يربح، لان مع هاد اف تي اكس راه لا ليست ديال الناس الواعرين في التريد وفي البيزنس، وما تصورش مليونيره وداك الشيء. الناس عندهم تجربه وعندهم لي كونطابل عندهم محامين وكل شيء، وكانوا كيعتبروا هاد الخينا راه بخير وهم تصيد. دور في دماغك، ماشي انت ولا حيت انت مكلاف ولا نو، هادشي كيطرا. ولكن اتونسيون هادوك داكشي اللي خسروا معانا هذا راه النهايه، راه ماشي غيمشيو يدلوا لي قدام كيقولوا في المغرب صافي طابين صافي غيموتوا بالجوع. لا، حطوا معاه شي فلوس وصافي. كاين اللي حط بزاف اكسيتيرا، ولكن ماشي حط فلوسو كاملين، فلوس ولادو وفلوس دارو، نتوما غادي خارجين الزنقه عايشين في الكيطون. نو، حاطين معاه واحد الانفستيسمون خسروا فيها ماشي مشكل. المره الجايه غادي يربحوا في حاجه اخرى، كيخسروا هنا يربحوا هنا. سفاين. اي واحد حط شي فلوس راه عارف راسو بامكانه دوك الفلوس يتحطوا في الزيرو. اي عمله قلت انا ولا اي واحد تيقول لك راه بامكانه تحط في الزيرو، واخا يكون اكسبير ما عرفاش تيبدا يقول لك هذا غيطلع وهذا ما من هنا وهذا ما عرف شنو هو. في الاخر غتجي حرب، غتجي شي حاجه بحال كورونا، غتجي شي قرينه كحله، الله يحفظنا كاملين، بام غتضرب داك الشيء بزاف. وهذا الشيء كاين واحد اللي عارفه هو الله سبحانه وتعالى، حتى واحد ما يقدر يعرف شنو قدر واخا ما عرفتش شنو. رايت سو هادشي كيطرا في البيزنس اون جينيرال. دونك عمرك ما تحط فلوس كاملين في حاجه واحده. اوكي، هذه مهمه. وهذه الاخرى في الاخير قال ليه انا بغيتك تعطي شي نصائح الناس اللي داخلين هادشي ديال الكريبتو وهاد المسائل، كيفاش ما يتصيدوش بالعربيه. بغيتك زعما تعطي نصائح الناس باش ما يتصيدوش حتى هما كيف تصيدوا الناس في اف تي اكس وفي هذيك ديال لونا تيرا لونا وداك الشيء كامل. كيفاش قال لي ودي الواحد يحضي ويشوف ديما الكونت ديال هذيك الشركه وشوف فين كدير هذوك فلوس اكسيتيرا. دابا هو كيعطينا النصائح، هو في الحق هذاك الشيء اصلا ما تيديروش هو. اوكي، هاد القضيه قلنا لكم بزاف المرات. اولا الكريبتو ملي تشريها من شي بلاصه، جبد الكريبتو ديالك وديرها في الواليت ديالك، اوكي، باش تقدر تبيعاتو تسويتي الا كاين شي مشكل، باش هما ما يقدروش يبلوكيوها لك. هذه الاولى. ثانيا خصك تشوف هذيك العمله ودوك الناس اللي دايرين هذوك العمله واش فيهم شي ثقه ولا لا. ودابا صعيب باش دير ثقه في شي واحد. انا ما نقول لك حتى واحد، ما خاطر كانت شي شركه كبيره شركه كبيره مهمه اكسيتيرا، بحال كيف كنقولوا كنعاودوا ديما سولانا شركه كبيره ومهمه جدا، وراك شفتوها ديما في التلفزيون كيهضروا معاهم وداك الشيء، ناس محترمين وماشي ديال التفريه. اوكي، ولكن مع ذلك ما تحطش فيها فلوس كاملين. مع ذلك ما تجيش تلوح فلوس كاملين بيكوز شتي في التلفزيون ولا شتي شركه مزيانه، لا، حط فيها شوي 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 باش الا قفر هذاك قفر هذا. وهادشي كامل الكريبتو كورنسي الا بغيتي تدخل ليه، الا كنتي جديد مرحبا غتشري البيتكوين والايثيريوم، هاد الجوج هادو هما الوحيدين اللي غتشري. هادو الا ما كانوش ما كايناش بلوكتشين كامله، ومستحيل ما تكونش بلوكتشين، مستحيل. وهذا هو المستقبل بزاف. كاينين عملات اخرين بحال اكس ار بي، بحال الجوراند، بحال سولانا كيف قلت لكم، ولكن دابا ماشي واحد الشريان ديال سولانا. مثلا كاردانو، كاينين شيبا حتى هي بامال مزيانه، ولكن ما حطش فيها الفلوس كاملين بزاف. الا بغيتي فلوس كاملين ونعزز عليك الكريبتو كورنسي، شري بها البيتكوين يتسخر لك، ما تشري حتى حاجه اخرى. بيتكوين بوحدو وتسخر لك، بحال شريتي شي دار تسخر الله. دابا 5 سنين 10 سنين غتكتبها في سميت ولدك، غيجي غيلقى يولي ملياردير ولدك وصافي. هادشي اللي كاين من هادشي كامل. واخا تبقى تعدي حتى تعيا فهادشي ديال الكريبتو كورنسي، ما كايناش قوانين ولا بد تيكونوا مشاكل. رايت الا كنتي كتعرف تربح راه كتقدر تربح. كتدخل في شي كريبتو يلاه باديه، كتحط فيها شي مصاريف $1000 ولا $2000، كتطلع طلعه زوينه، كتاخذ الربح ديالك وكتخرج. اوكي، الا كنتي ما كتعرفش وكتخلي فلوس وما عارفش امتى تاخذ وامتى هذا، ولا مثلا كتشوفها طالعه حتى كتطلع السماعات كتشريها في الاخر كتهبط وكتخسر فلوس كامل تبكي، ما كتعرفش اشنو كاين. دونك تكالم مع راسك. الحقيقه خلي البيتكوين تيهبط، شريه وتسخر لور، ولا شريه ونساه عام عامين حتى يطلع بخير وعلى خير. دوك الساعات الا بغيتي تبيع بيع، الا ما بغيتيش تبيع خلي الانفستيسمون ديالك. هذا هو الحل ودي النصائح ديالي. اوكي، وحدوا مع راسنا كاملين، وحدوا مع فلوسك. اوكي، وديما مغرب، واسترا بيستا، باي باي، ونتبع لي.